Good. So I'm a Texas sports fan. So I'm from Houston. So I actually like my main allegiance is to the Rockets. But if you're familiar with how they're playing the last couple of years, ever since Harden was traded, I'm definitely cheering for Luka and the Mavs in the meantime. But so I'm associate professor of philosophy at the University of St. Joseph in Macau, China's only Catholic university. And I got interested in religious epistemology because I thought that was a really interesting question. Can we know that God exists? Right? Can we know that God exists? Is it rational for me to believe that God exists? And so ended up becoming like an agnostic for a very short period of time, and I was about to just go ahead and embrace like Nietzschean atheism, and then until I did the what millennials usually do when they have a crisis, they turn to Google, and I Googled evidence for God, and ended up finding some Old Testament passages that really just made me think this is talking about Jesus, right? Specifically Isaiah 53. And so the next morning I'm late to class. So if my high school teachers are listening to this somehow in some way, ignore this. But I was already late to school. So I was like, whatever. I'm going to pull over into a Starbucks coffee shop, parking lot. And I'm going to open up my Bible and I'm going to ask God to reveal himself to me. And I did that, and I felt God's presence tangibly, and my heart just became pure joy, and I started rushing home from school every day to learn more about Christ and Scripture, and so ended up really interested in apologetics. I started street evangelizing 2 months later, and realized that, hey, if I'm going to encounter people, right, where to meet them where they're at, I need to know apologetics. And then it took me about, 2 years or so to realize if I'm going to do apologetics, especially for me, how I think and what I'm interested in, I need to do philosophy. I needed to kind of approach it more philosophically. And so, ended up doing getting into philosophy, ended up doing a master's in philosophy of religion. And in that, I ended up reading Plantigan's Warranted Christian Belief. And I basically was like, you know what? I'm just going to model my career after this guy and, try to argue for defend whatever he says. So that's roughly how I got into doing religious epistemology.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and all the discussions that you've been in that I've listened to are things everyone just calls you Catholic Calvin Plantigan. So I guess that's so. Maybe be helpful.
I am, but not worthy. But thank you. Yeah.
So maybe just to start off, Tyler, can you talk a little bit about what is epistemology and what is religious epistemology?
Yeah, sure. So epistemology, formally, is the study of knowledge, right? But more precisely, we can say that it's the study of epistemic concepts such as rationality, such as if a belief is warranted, right? If a belief is justified, what is knowledge? What are the conditions that need to be in place in order to say that I know some proposition, right? I mean, so standardly, epistemology looks at these sorts of questions, right? From a standard point of view, it looks at questions about knowledge, about rationality, about justification, right? That's what epistemology is. And so then religious epistemology would be applying these questions to religious belief and practice. So is it rational to believe that God exists, right? Can I be justified in thinking that some particular religious claim is true, such as Jesus raising from the dead? So how does the liturgy play a role in my doxastic formation of, in reference to forming religious beliefs, right? And so these are the sorts of questions that religious epistemology asks.
So maybe you could talk a little bit about Plantigan religious epistemology and the kind of approach that you take, Tyler.
Yeah, sure. So Plantiga defends a thesis called Reformed Epistemology. Now, for your viewers who are not Reformed in their soteriology, don't worry, because as a Catholic, I'm not Reformed in my soteriology either. But I still endorse the thesis of Reformed Epistemology. Reformed Epistemology is the thesis that religious belief can be properly basic, or to put it in another way, that religious belief can be justified or warranted apart from argumentation, right? So the idea isn't that that there aren't good arguments for the existence of God, right? I think that there are some, actually. Cosmological arguments. I've defended a political argument for God's existence. I'm a big fan of the first way. So Swinburne's and inductive arguments, I think, are quite persuasive. But the idea is that they're not necessary, right, in order to have rational or warranted or justified religious belief. And so, Plantiga talks about, he thinks this sort of insight is found in both Aquinas and Calvin. So he talks about his AC model, right, after Aquinas and Calvin. And specifically, it has its roots in Calvin's The Institutes of Christian Religion, specifically Book 1, I believe, where Calvin talks about how we all have a sensus divinitatis, sense of divinity. He interprets Calvin to endorse some sort of like cognitive faculty that we all have as human beings that's aimed toward producing belief in God, and it's enables us to become aware of the divine. And so, Plantiga ends up endorsing also. So you don't have to be an externalist or a proper functionalist to endorse Reformed epistemology. There are internalist and non-proper functionalist glossings, but as a proper functionalist, he argues that that if this cognitive faculty or cognitive systems are aimed toward producing belief about God, and our faculties are functioning properly and aimed at the production of true belief and in the environment for which our faculties were designed, then the religious beliefs that the sensus divinitatis produces would have warrant. And so as a proper functionalist, he's going to argue that if we have cognitive faculties that are designed to produce theistic belief, and if they're functioning properly and successfully in the truth, then religious belief, belief about God, is warranted. Mm-hmm. And so he doesn't think that you have to know that you know in order to know, right? This is called KK thesis. He doesn't think you have to know that you're justified or know that you're warranted, right? The idea is that just as long as these conditions are in play, you don't have to have access to whether or not these conditions are in play, right? Mm-hmm. Are in place. As long as they are, when you form this belief, then the belief would have positive epistemic status. And so we can take a quick mundane example to help further illustrate this, and then we can once again apply it to religious belief once more. A lot of philosophers are not really compelled by the arguments that exist in the literature for the existence of other minds. Mm-hmm. Right? Not a lot of good arguments for the existence of other minds. And Plantiga argues against some standard sort of arguments. Like you might think one is like, hey, I have a mind and I have this body thing, and that looks like a body thing, and it's moving in the same way my body moves, so probably it has a mind too, right? Mm-hmm. Or maybe you look at this really abductively and you just analyze that, well, hey, all the information that I have, right, seeing this individual here, this something here that appears to be an individual, seeing that there's appears to be a communication going back and forth, right? All this together, it's the best explanation that this is another mind, right? that there is another mind that is existing. So here's some like standard ways of looking at whether or not there are good arguments for other minds. Here's a problem. Here's one of Plantinga's responses to these sorts of arguments. He argues that these explanations, these hypotheses, are not really simple in comparison to some other competing hypotheses. So let's hopefully the listener is familiar with René Descartes, right? Mm-hmm. And obviously Descartes ponders, how do I know I'm not being deceived by an evil demon, right? And there's a question about whether or not all of his experiences, his beliefs, his desires, his all his seemings, etc., are actually the result of a demon tricking him, right? Instead of they're actually being real things that correspond with these experiences and seemings, and so on and so forth. Well, look at this hypothesis, right? Instead of postulating that there are about 8 billion other minds, and perhaps even more, different in the galaxy or universe or universes, right, in the multiverse, or postulating that just 2 immaterial minds exist, right? You and a tricky Cartesian demon monster, right? Or we can even go simpler. Perhaps the only thing that exists is you. But you came into existence a few seconds ago with all the experience and beliefs that you currently have, right? Right. These seem like simpler hypotheses. This is what Plantinga points out, and this sort of thing, and warrant and proper function. And so the idea is like, are we just going to say that other minds, our belief in other minds, is irrational or it's not warranted just because we don't have access to good arguments for this belief? And Plantinga is like, no. If you were hardwired to produce belief that other minds exist, right? Say like when I'm talking to you, my brain, right, my cognitive faculties more specifically are hardwired to produce the belief that I'm talking to another person, another mind. And if my faculties are successfully aimed at truth and properly functioning, then my belief would be warranted. It's the same way that dogs, monkeys, young children, infants, they can have knowledge too, right? They can have knowledge because of how they're hardwired and because their faculties function properly and are successfully aimed at truth. And so do children know? Do young children, infants, do dogs, right, have these like beliefs about their epistemic status, right? Like, do they have to know that their faculties are functioning properly in order to know that, like, ball here, right? Or food here, right? Or mama, right? No, obviously their cognitive capacities are far too limited for that. But nonetheless, they can still have knowledge. Following Ernest Sosa, we can call this animal knowledge. And so it seems like we can apply this to belief in God as well. And that's essentially what Plantinga is doing.
I'm curious to like, how would you deal with like maybe like experiences or perceived experiences in, like, other religions or traditions? So like obviously like I'd be curious, like, what do you think about like maybe like one, like a Muslim having some sort of like experience that they take to be like Allah and like confirming like Islam, or like a Protestant saying like, here's my, I don't even know if this is feasible, but like here's my Protestant experience, like
right.
Catholicism. Right. How would you deal with those kind of differing, assuming these things are possible, how would you assume with them?
Right. So good questions. So in a book with Eric Baldwin and I, we actually have 2 books now and he's also in the Debating Christian one. So really, depending on how you count it, it could be 3. Yeah. But we have a book dedicated to kind of like exploring Plantinga's religious epistemology and other religious traditions, right? Mm-hmm. And so we look to explore whether or not Advaita Vedanta Hindus or Mahayana Buddhists or Neo-Confucians, right, Muslims, Jews, if they can make the same sorts of claims that Plantinga makes, right? Can they make sense of his AC or extended AC model? Mm-hmm. And in it, we argue through a lot of the chapters that really, what is proper function, right? What's a good account of proper function? Can we make sense of proper function without something like an intentional designer of our cognitive faculties? Right? So there are lots of great naturalist proper functionalists like Peter Graham, for example. Ernest Sosa isn't far off from proper function, and he's right there. But oftentimes naturalists will talk about proper function in evolutionary terms or in terms of history. We can get into that if you want, but roughly the idea is like we argue that these accounts don't work following Plantinga. These sorts of attempts of proper function don't work. And really, we're going to need a conscious, intelligent designer who is concerned with us only believing true things, right? Or with us, at least overall, maybe not every single belief needs to be true. But the idea is that overall, we have general reliability of our faculties. He's not out to massively deceive us, right? And the design plan of our faculties, to make sense of it, we think that if you buy into Kalam considerations, that the design plan can't be one that has this sort of infinite story in the background, where it assumes, my design plan assumes an infinite amount of time and an infinite amount of designers, right? Something like that. And we think that you get this sort of thing in Mormonism, this sort of problem in Mormonism, and then in Hindu cosmologies, there's this idea of infinite cycles and so forth, in which our cognitive faculties are conceived. Basically what this does is it starts to show how lots of religious traditions actually can't make sense of Plantinga's epistemology unless, it's a God who wants us to have generally reliable cognitive faculties, and our design story isn't one that assumes an actual infinite, and so on and so forth. And so it really does kind of narrow it down to who can make use of Plantinga's epistemology. So you would think that some of the traditional non-theistic traditions, like Buddhism, wouldn't be able to make use of Plantinga's epistemology. Now, of course, Eric and I just had a book published with Bloomsbury recently, where we argue that there is a way to interpret Buddhism as consistent with classical theism. And so, maybe we need to reshape how we view some of these religious traditions and ways in which they can use Plantinga's epistemology, but traditionally, as it normally appears, not so much. With Islam, we argue that largely within the Islamic tradition, definitely within the Kalam tradition, there's this idea of this, in order to truly know, to have really robust knowledge, you need to know that you know. You need to test the Quran to see if it's true. You need to be able to have access to the reasons which confer the warrant for your belief, sort of thing, right? There's this internalist or meta level requirement that we can sort of gloss in a few different ways, but being extremely general here. Hopefully this is enough to paint the picture. And so that's very unlike Plantinga's epistemology. Now, there's a philosopher who shows that Ivan Taimian, Jamie Turner, he doesn't have this. He's much more of an externalist, much more Plantinga friendly. But that is generally outside of the main philosophical tradition within Islam. And so you might also worry about in the Quran, Allah seems to boast a lot about deception. So you might also worry about that sort of condition as well. But anyway, generally, this is kind of how I would approach these things. But honestly, it doesn't matter, right? Just because they can use Plantinga's epistemology, what follows from that, right? Nothing. I could also say well, hey, if I'm designed to produce the belief that I've been created by a Cartesian demon monster and my faculties are functioning properly. Well, then, you know what? I could have warrant that I'm being deceived, right? Or that I'm in a simulation, right? With moral claims, right? We will disagree on moral claims sometimes as human beings. But yet no one thinks that you need to suspend your belief just because there's moral disagreement, right? Or at least generally, that's not how we approach the area. So if all of a sudden, this is one of the lines that Plantigan likes to give, if all of a sudden you and I are disagreeing, I say that it's okay to lie about my colleagues in order to advance my career, and you say no, and we argue it out, and I give you all my arguments, you give me all your arguments, and it's a stalemate at the end of the day. A lot of us still think that you can be warranted and rational in keeping with your belief that it's wrong to lie about your colleagues to advance your career, even though I exist. And even if I'm, say, your epistemic peer who at least de facto epistemic peer, who disagrees with you. So I don't think much follows from it.
That's super helpful, Tyler. And I like thinking about this idea that it seems like with under these other religious traditions, there may not be that reason to trust your faculties, having that experience. That's a super helpful clarification. Looking like Plantigan and religious epistemology. Oh my gosh, so many big words. So I'm curious then, Tyler, so you talk about this idea, and a lot of this, the questions I drew up were based off your Cambridge Elevens book on religious epistemology. So talk about the idea of how could your religious beliefs be a properly basic belief? I'm curious what you think here.
Yeah, so just going back to what we were saying earlier, if and notice I'm not saying we are designed, right? Right now I'm just saying if we are designed to produce belief that God exists, or that God created the heavens, or that God created the flowers we pick up, right? And imagine someone's at a beautiful waterfall, right? They pick up a flower, they look at all of its delicacies, all of the intricacies of the flower, the texture, everything, and they just feel all of a sudden this overwhelming experience, right? That leads them to believe that God created this flower, or there's some sort of designer, right, behind this flower, right? Well, hey, if you're designed to pick up this sort of agency, if you're designed to see God's fingerprint in things, right, then when you see God's fingerprint in things, assuming your cognitive faculties are functioning properly, then hey, your belief about God's handiwork would be warranted, right? And if true, you'd have knowledge. So yeah, in a sense, properly basic beliefs are beliefs that can be justified or warranted apart from other arguments, right? And so the question is, well, this contrast-based beliefs, which are based on our basic beliefs, right, require arguments. And so there's a question about what makes these beliefs properly basic and these not, right? And as a proper functionalist, I would argue, well, it's the design plan of our cognitive faculties, right, that determine whether or not we need to have access to some sort of argument for holding to the belief in question, which is ultimately grounded in the mind of God.
Yeah, that's super helpful. And I think it's helpful to emphasize this idea that if our cognitive faculties are designed to understand these truths, then we'd have a reliable way of understanding this. This is really helpful. So maybe you could talk to other about cognitive science and how that supports Plantigan and religious epistemology. I'm just curious because this is something that was new to me. So I'm curious what you have here.
Yeah. So in the Elements volume, and then I've got a new volume with Michael DeVito, who I think's been on your show.
Yeah.
And we've got a new paper in religions on sort of cognitive science and classical theism specifically, but we discuss a little bit about what I'm going to discuss here with you. So if anyone's listening, that's open access. You can just Google it and you'll find the copy. So the paradigm view within cognitive science is that religious belief is an evolutionary spandrel. It's a byproduct of certain evolutionary factors that are advantageous for our survival. There are lots of different ways to view this. One way is stemming from how we're naturally dualists, and so maybe there's this story we can tell from being intuitive dualists to get to God, right? The main story that I like to tell, that I think find compelling personally, is the idea that we have a hyper agency detection device. And so the idea is that as organisms that are surviving, if you have an agency detection device that is sensitive to agency, you're probably going to be better off than an organism that has a detection device, but it's not very sensitive, right? It only works half the time, or even if it only works 3/4 the time, right? You want an agency detection device that maybe is going to be even too sensitive, right? It's better to be too sensitive, right? To have some false positives on occasion, just so you're extra alert and aware, than to have your agency detection device not really be good, right? Not work enough. You're going to die basically if that happens. And so we detect agency, right? We have an agency detection device, and it's quite hypersensitive. We see teleology in the world. We see design. So there's been studies done. So Deborah Keelman, she asks, children, why are rocks pointy? And they'll come up with really anthropomorphic or teleological explanations, such as, so animals won't sit on them, right? And they prefer teleology. They see teleology. There's been studies done to show that uneducated adults prefer teleological explanations. There's been studies done showing that this is cross-cultural, our religious cognition, right? It's not just us who have been shaped in the West, right? It's also in China too. In fact, there's a really good edited volume called Religious Cognition in China that makes all these points. And so it's said that we are promiscuous about our teleology, right? We see teleology even when it's not there, right? And again, this goes along with our sensitive agency detection device. You throw a theory of mind in, and then we can come up with some compelling reasons as to why we naturally believe in God or gods or the supernatural. So this is the paradigm view, is that we do naturally believe in gods. This whole new atheist thing where it's if we just wiped out religion right now and never taught it to our children, right? Religion would be forever dead, right? Religion is something taught, right? Belief in the supernatural is taught. It's no. We are religious animals, right? We are religious animals, and cognitive science, again, supports the idea that this is a natural feature of man, because it's an evolutionary byproduct. And so, there are objections from cognitive science where it's hey, if your hyper agency detection device is also picking up belief in false gods or belief in ghosts or fairies, well then, you shouldn't trust your faculty when it comes to producing belief in God or Yahweh, right? And so I don't know. I can get into responding to this sort of objection. I don't know if you want us to go there, but I did want to make sure I painted that honestly.
Yeah, maybe it'd be helpful to have a little bit on idea of dealing with false gods or fairies or things like that. So yeah.
Right. Okay. So there are different ways that you can respond, and I've defended two particular ways. One starts off by saying, well, actually, our agency detection device is quite reliable, right? I mean, when I get around people, my faculty generally produces the belief that people are around me, right? It's pretty good at detecting agency. And so then you might say, well, it's not when it comes to detecting humans. It's in reference to when it comes to detecting non-physical things. That's when it's unreliable. But it seems like in this way, you're going to have to assume that the supernatural isn't, that God isn't there in order to show that we're not reliable detectors of of divinity. Because like, what if God exists and he's designed our faculties in such a way where he's going to kill two birds with one stone. He's going to allow us to be a bit sensitive to agency so that we survive and reproduce. But he also knows that by making us extra sensitive to the supernatural, our faculties being extra sensitive, then we're also going to believe in him. We're going to become aware that there is a supernatural reality to this world. And so it seems to me that, what if that's all that God's after? He just wants us to broadly come to the belief that he exists, that he is, right? That divinity is. It can be, I argue that it can be likened to being in a dark room where there's just like, imagine everything is pitch black. And there are these objects in the room that aren't like obvious what they are. And like you and your friends are all looking around, right? Well, trying to figure out what's there. Well, in one sense, everyone's cognitive faculties in the room are reliable in a very broad sense. Because in a very broad sense, everyone's coming to the right belief that there are objects in the room. Now, it might not be narrowly reliable, right? One might say this is a piano and the other person says it's a Coke machine, right? I mean, maybe we have reason to distrust, at least independently by ourselves, that our perception in the room is robustly reliable or narrowly reliable. But it seems at least generally, right? This is a very basic, generic sense. Our faculties are reliable. So, I mean, obviously sociology is going to play a role in the sort of God concept that we're going to have, right? And so it seems like you might experience divinity as these fairies with godlike features, or it's common in certain parts of the world to perceive Buddha as omniscient and omnipotent and so forth, right? I mean, you and obviously within Islam and Christianity and Judaism, right, seeing the God of classical theism, sociology is going to have an impact, a role on this. But the idea is that generally the hyper agency detection device is pretty good still at getting us to become aware that there is, right, that there is something there. Yeah. And so it doesn't seem too troubling to think about reliability in this way. And then, of course, you can just be like a hardcore Plantigan and say, well, hey, I get it from a third-person perspective point of view. The evidence doesn't look too good that my cognitive faculties are aimed at truth and everyone else is wrong, or all these other people are wrong, but mine's right. But you might just say, you know what, even upon reflecting on this fact, I still can't kick my belief that God exists, right? Well, if you're designed in such a way as to not be able to kick that belief, right? If you're designed to still just find yourself, right, believing that he exists, and your faculties are functioning properly, and there's a high statistical probability that the belief being produced under these conditions is true, then hey, you still have warrant. So anyway, these two sorts of responses, I think, are quite helpful. But yeah, we are religious animals indeed.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And you look at like the dispersity of religious belief, and it's just all across the world for most of human history. So it's like, I totally see where you're coming from there, Tyler. So one more thing I'd love to talk about.
Just real quick, I forgot to mention, and then of course we can like work together as a group. Like imagine we're back in the dark room. And we can cooperate, use philosophy, use science, right? Maybe we have to assume certain metaphysical principles and do certain experiments and learn who to trust in the room. Maybe someone's a little bit better at figuring out objects in the room than other people, right? Learn who to trust, learn who not to trust, right? And through group cooperation, maybe we can get to reality more precisely. And so just because our sense of divinity is just very broad and general, it doesn't mean we can't get to a more definite answer, right, as to what is there. So I just wanted to clarify that before we moved on.
Yeah, that's super helpful. Thanks for clarifying. So one more question, Tyler, and it's this idea of like, could religious epistemology provide an argument for the existence of God? So yeah.
Right. So, back to what I was saying earlier, where I think there are not good naturalistic accounts of proper function, right? And let's just go ahead and assume Plantinga's right? I've defended the idea that proper functionalist thesis is correct. Andrew Moon, Kenny Boyce have, Michael Bergman has, right? Obviously, Plantinga has. Right? Let's assume that proper functionalism is true for the moment. And let's now also assume that Plantinga is correct, that there aren't good naturalistic accounts of proper function. Well, then it seems like it follows that proper function is like a precondition needed to make intelligible the idea that we have knowledge. And so if you can buy a premise, say because it seems obvious to you that we do have knowledge, right? And we wouldn't have knowledge if God didn't exist. Then you can quickly say, okay, well, we since we have knowledge, therefore God must exist, right? So I give this sort of argument in the chapter 4 of the Elements volume. Basically, a parody is just sort of a William Lane Craig's standard moral argument, right? But instead it's talking about knowledge. So yeah, anyway, that seems like a good argument to me. If you're a committed proper functionalist and you're committed to what is obvious, namely that we know some stuff at least, then it seems to follow that God exists.
It's tricky for the atheist or the person that doesn't hold a religious belief, because they're gonna have to say that, every religious experience, religious encounter, whatever it is, regardless of any tradition, they all have to be false. Because if they imply that a god or a gods exist, then you have to say it's false if you're an atheist, and that's a challenge. And I was just thinking about that as you were talking about your argument. So yeah. Awesome. Well, there's one more question. There's one question that was put in the chat as we were talking to that I think would be interesting. And we'll wrap up. And it's a question from Wesley Banzer, which says, "There's the exposition in Vatican II about God being able to save people in other religions. So this is a Catholic council. Lend credence to non-Christian religious experience." So what do you think here, Tyler? I'm curious.
Yes, I'm actually working on a book right now on evangelism, like an analytic theology of evangelism. And one of the chapters is dedicated to a Christology of other religions, right? And one of the primary sort of evidences that I'm utilizing is Vatican II. Lumen Gentium, as well as some other documents, so in it, it's the Catholic position is that people who don't know that Christ is the Messiah, that Christ died for our sins, people who don't know that that Christ founded the church, right? They can be still right with God. They can be connected with the church. They can be connected with Christ without recognizing it, right? This is, Karl Rahner's Anonymous Christians. So, in the same way, like in the Old Testament, Abraham was right with God. Paul even seems to think he believed in the gospel, but clearly he didn't have an explicit understanding, right, of Christ. So it's in the same way that individuals and different religious traditions, right, they have truths in their religious traditions and their cultural customs. Vatican II talks about, and these truths are holy. And the idea is that if they're, in a sense, Christ is the origin, is responsible for the truths that are holy that they believe in. Christ is the author of these truths. And their conscience, in a sense, right, its author is Christ. And it, working in conjunction with these holy truths that Christ has given them, right, in the same way that Abraham sort of believed his truths that he had that pointed to the gospel, well, in the same way that these individuals could be believing in the gospel, moved by grace first. So it's not, heretical, not Pelagian, and trusting in what they have that points to Christ, that is Christ, right? Then that can allow them to be connected with the church in Christ without explicitly understanding that they are connected to the church in Christ.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much today, Tyler, for coming on. I've really enjoyed this interview and this conversation, everything you've had to say. So is there any last thoughts or things you want to say before we wrap up here?
I guess so just the final thought about the comment. Yeah, so if these other religious traditions have holy truths and customs, then it seems like, and if cognitive science sort of points us that we all are aware of divinity, right? At least generally on a normative basis. Then yeah, it seems to me that this is some good reason to think that we need to take other religious tradition seriously when they convey what they convey with respect to their religious experience. And so that doesn't have to refute Christianity by any means. I'm a committed Christian who affirms John 14:6. But at the same time, maybe we need to become more creative, accommodating and making room for other religious experiences that aren't traditionally seen as Christian. But other than that, feel free to send all heresy hate mail to Zach here.
Yeah, it's totally not Tyler's website that's linked right in the description. So
exactly.
Just ignore that. Find my email somewhere in there, and then you can send it all to me. And
That's right.
Nothing was ever said. So, but thank you so much, Tyler. It's been such a fun conversation. I've really enjoyed this. So, thank you so much for coming on today.
All right, man. Take care. God bless.
Yeah, thank you everyone for tuning in. I hope you have a good one. We wish you the best, and God bless.